"Call your village mom, she'll be my maid," my mother-in-law said, and she wasn't whispering it to a friend or muttering it under her breath where I might not catch it. She said it clearly, at full volume, standing in the middle of my kitchen, with the satisfied composure of someone who had just said something obvious. My mother was on the phone in my hand at that exact moment, mid-sentence about her tomato garden back home, and the words landed so precisely into the gap in the conversation that for one suspended second I genuinely could not process what language I had just heard. What happened after that destroyed a marriage, exposed a plan 3 years in the making, and taught me something about dignity that I could not have learned any other way. But none of it makes sense without the beginning. And the beginning, the way most real catastrophes begin, looked almost nothing like what it was. My name is Sarah. I was 32 years old when all of this happened, the daughter of a woman named Adiz who grew tomatoes and pepper in a small garden behind a house in a mid-sized town in eastern Nigeria, and who had raised me with the particular combination of warmth and absolute precision that produces either very confident people or very anxious ones, and had, in my case, produced someone who was both at different times depending on the situation. I had come to the United States on a graduate school scholarship 12 years before this story begins, finished a master's degree in public health, built a career at a nonprofit that did maternal health work across 3 states, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, fallen in love with a man named Gregory Osemensa, second-generation Ghanaian American, 36 years old, civil engineer, who had a laugh that came from somewhere south of his ribcage and a way of listening to you talk that made you feel like what you were saying was genuinely interesting, even on days when it wasn't. We had dated for 2 years before marrying. We had been married for 3 years when the sentence about my mother happened. And in those 3 years, I had been learning, slowly, incrementally, in the particular way you learn things you don't want to know, exactly who Gregory's mother was and what she had decided about me. Her name was Constance. Constance Osemensa, 64 years old, born in Kumasi, raised partly in London, resident of a 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb of Atlanta for the past 22 years. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that fills a room before she's finished entering it, not because she was loud, though she could be, but because she had spent 64 years being the largest personality in whatever space she occupied and had developed, as a result, an unconscious expectation that rooms would configure themselves around her. She had deep-set eyes that were intelligent and constantly evaluating, and she wore her hair natural, cropped close to her head, and her clothes were always deliberate. She was not a casual dresser, not even in her own home, not even on a Sunday morning. When she came to visit us, she arrived pressed and purposeful, and when she sat in my living room she sat in it the way a person sits in a space they have already decided belongs to them by some logic that predates occupation. She had opinions about everything, our furniture arrangement, the particular brand of palm oil I bought, the way I organized the kitchen cabinets, the temperature at which I served rice. She delivered these opinions in Twi mixed with English, fluidly and without pause, and when I didn't respond in Twi, because my Twi was limited to the phrases Gregory had taught me over 2 years of dating, she would look at me with an expression of mild, patient disappointment, as if my linguistic gap were a character failing I had simply not yet bothered to correct. Gregory and I lived in a 3-bedroom house in Decatur, Georgia, that we had bought 18 months into our marriage with a down payment we'd saved together over 3 years of careful combined finances, me contributing 60% because my salary was higher at the time, Gregory contributing 40% and a great deal of sweat equity in the renovation work he did himself on the bathrooms and the back deck. The house had a kitchen that I loved in the specific, territorial way of someone who has learned to cook seriously in a small space and who values the particular geography of a kitchen that has been organized precisely to her hand, the spice rack arranged by frequency of use, the knife stored blade inward, the heavy Dutch oven on the bottom shelf because it was used every week, not hidden away for occasions. I cooked most evenings, real cooking, the kind my mother had taught me and that I had expanded over the years through cookbooks and experiment and the accumulated wisdom of other West African women I knew who took food as seriously as I did. Gregory ate everything I made with the specific, genuine enthusiasm of a person who cannot believe his luck, and in that, at least, in the first 2 years, we were completely aligned. The house also had a third bedroom that we used as a guest room, a pleasant enough room, clean and simply furnished, with a window that looked out on the back garden and a full bathroom attached. This room was where Constance slept on her visits, which happened 4 or 5 times a year and lasted, each time, between 10 days and 3 weeks. I want to be precise about that duration because I think precision matters when you're trying to understand how a thing accumulates into something you can no longer pretend is manageable. 10 days to 3 weeks, 4 or 5 times a year. That is, at minimum, 40 days a year and at maximum over 3 months, of Constance Osemensa in my house, in my kitchen, at my table, with her evaluating eyes and her opinions about the palm oil and the rice temperature and, eventually, my mother. Gregory was, in almost every other respect, a person I chose with my full faculties and would choose again. He was steady where I was reactive, patient where I was quick to conclude, and he had a quality of fundamental kindness, not performed kindness, not strategic warmth, but the genuine article, that I recognized from the beginning and that I believe was real. His relationship with his mother was the one place where that steadiness and patience turned into something else, something that looked from the outside like love and accommodation and filial duty, and from the inside, from where I was standing, looked more like a door that was always already unlocked for her and permanently latched for me. He had been raised by Constance alone. His father had returned to Ghana when Gregory was 7 and had remained a peripheral figure in his life, present in phone calls and occasional visits but not in the daily architecture of his upbringing. Constance had worked 2 jobs for 6 years to put Gregory through school, had gone without things herself so he could have what he needed, had built her entire adult identity around the project of her son's success, and Gregory carried this knowledge in his body the way you carry a debt you have decided you can never fully repay, with a kind of permanent, low-grade obligation that overrode everything else when it came to choosing sides. He never chose sides openly. He was too careful for that. But when the weight of any situation required a distribution, it was never Constance who absorbed the larger share. It was always, quietly, me. The first visit I remember clearly, the one that, in retrospect, contained every subsequent one in miniature, was 6 weeks after our wedding. Constance came for 2 weeks, ostensibly to celebrate, practically to assess. She moved through the house on the first day with the quiet thoroughness of an inspector, opening cabinets without asking, running a finger along the shelf above the stove, examining the spice rack with the focused attention of someone building a case. She did not say anything critical that first day. She simply looked, and I felt the looking, the way you feel a draft before you see the open window. On the second day, she rearranged my kitchen spice rack while I was at work. I came home to find the spices organized alphabetically, basil before cayenne, cayenne before coriander, in a system that was internally logical and completely useless to the way I actually cooked. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the reorganized rack, and then I looked at Gregory, who was at the kitchen table with his laptop, and he looked at me and said, "She was just trying to help." That was the first time he said that sentence. It would not be the last. I reorganized the spices back to my system after she went to bed that night, quietly, in the dark kitchen, and I said nothing about it to either of them, and this was the pattern I established in the first 2 weeks of our marriage's first real test, and I maintained it, at escalating personal cost, for 3 years. The symbol I will carry from this story is a wooden spoon. My mother had given it to me when I left for America, not an heirloom, not an antique, just a good, heavy wooden spoon from the market in our town, worn smooth from years of her use, with a small crack near the handle that had been there as long as I could remember and that I had never once repaired because repairing it felt like changing something that was perfect by being exactly what it was. I used that spoon for everything, stirring jollof rice, working a stew, scraping the good bits from the bottom of a pot. When Constance first saw it, 3 months into the marriage, she picked it up, examined it, and set it down with the particular care of someone replacing something they consider beneath the standard of the environment. She said nothing. But the look on her face when she set it down, the fraction of a second of something between pity and disdain, registered in me like a temperature change, and I filed it away in the part of my mind where I stored things I wasn't ready to address directly. That spoon became, over 3 years, the thing I looked at when I needed to remember who I was before Constance decided who I was going to be in her son's house. It becomes something else entirely by the end of this story. But I am getting ahead of myself. The trouble that was already building in year 2 of our marriage announced itself through a series of things so individually small that I would have dismissed any single one of them. Constance began asking, during her visits, about my mother. Not warmly, not conversationally, but with the pointed specificity of someone gathering information for a purpose. How old was she? Was she working? Did she have a pension? What was her health like? Was she alone there in the village? Constance always called it the village, though my mother lived in a proper town with a population of 60,000, a hospital, 2 universities, and reliable electricity. The word village was deployed consistently and without variation, with a particular emphasis that positioned it as a description rather than a dismissal, which allowed Constance to use it in front of Gregory without him registering it as what it was. I registered it. Every time. It landed in the same place in my chest, a low, specific pressure, the way repeated small impacts accumulate into a bruise. I answered the questions about my mother carefully, giving factual information and no emotional context, because emotional context in a conversation with Constance was currency she would spend against you later. Gregory noticed none of this, which I want to explain rather than simply report, because he noticed nothing is not the full picture. Gregory noticed things selectively, with a filter so refined by decades of loving his mother that certain categories of information simply didn't register in the form they were actually occurring. He saw Constance asking questions about my mother and interpreted it as interest. He saw me giving brief, careful answers and interpreted it as shyness or cultural reserve. He was not performing ignorance. He genuinely did not have the architecture, built from 36 years of being Constance's project and priority, to see her behavior as a campaign rather than a personality. This is the particular tragedy of that kind of love. It doesn't make you malicious, it just makes you blind in very specific and very damaging ways. I had married a man who loved me and who had, as a function of that love, a blind spot the exact shape and size of his mother's agenda. And I spent 3 years walking into the edge of it in the dark. I want to tell you about a dinner party in year 2, because it was the dinner party where the first real alarm sounded, not a distant bell you could choose to ignore, but a clear, close, specific tone that I heard perfectly and chose to interpret as something else, because the alternative interpretation required decisions I wasn't ready to make. We had 6 people over, 2 couples we were close to, Gregory's colleague Dion and his wife Priya, and my friend Amaka, who had been my closest friend since graduate school and who had, in the years of my marriage, maintained a careful and patient silence about certain things while making it very clear with her eyes that the patience was not unlimited. Constance was visiting, day 9 of a 2-week stay, and she was at the dinner table, which she always was when there were guests, because guests were an audience and Constance had never met an audience she didn't use. The dinner was good. I had made a gussie soup and jollof rice and fried plantain, the real kind, the kind that takes 2 hours and fills the house with a smell that makes people walk into the kitchen to see what's happening. Constance sat at the table and ate and said very little during the meal, which should have been my signal that something was being conserved for later. It came over dessert. The conversation had moved to the topic of family. Dion's mother had just retired, Priya's parents had recently visited from Mumbai, and in the easy, warm way of dinner conversation among people who know each other reasonably well, the subject of parents and distance and how you manage it came up. Constance, who had been quiet for 40 minutes, chose this moment to lean forward and say, to the table in general, "It's a pity Sarah's mother is so far. All the way back in the village." She said it with the warmth of someone expressing genuine concern. She said the village with the particular, practiced ease of someone who has used the phrase so consistently it has become unremarkable. I looked up from my plate. Amaka, across the table, had gone very still. Priya's expression shifted by a fraction of a degree toward careful neutrality. Gregory was reaching for the water pitcher. "She must miss her," Constance continued, pleasantly. "A mother wants to be near her children. It's a natural thing." She looked at me. "Maybe one day she can come and stay." "Really stay?" The pause before "really stay" was so brief you might have missed it if you weren't listening for it. I was listening. I heard it as clearly as a key turning in a lock, the first unlocking of something I didn't yet understand the full shape of. I said my mother visited when she could and was happy at home, and I smiled, and the dinner continued, and later that night I lay awake in our bed while Gregory slept beside me, turning the sentence over and over, really stay, trying to understand what was inside it, and telling myself I was reading too much into a dinner conversation. But I wasn't. I was, in fact, reading exactly the right amount into it. I just didn't have the next piece yet, the piece that would make the picture complete. That piece arrived 6 months later. I found it on a Thursday evening when Gregory was at a work dinner that had run long. I had been cleaning the guest room after Constance's most recent stay. She had left 2 days before, after 11 days, and I was stripping the bed and putting fresh linens on when I noticed that the small decorative box on the bedside table, which I kept there purely for aesthetic purposes and which was normally empty, had something in it. I was not looking for anything. This is important. I was not snooping, not suspicious in the active, searching way. I was changing sheets and the box was there and something white was visible through the slightly open lid, and I opened it the way you open something that is part of your own house and therefore yours to open. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Not typed, handwritten, in Constance's script, which I recognized because she had signed birthday cards in it, a large, deliberate cursive that she wrote with the concentrated attention of someone for whom writing is an act of self-presentation. The paper was folded in thirds, the way you fold a letter. I unfolded it. It was a list. A handwritten list, in Twi and English mixed, spanning the full page front and back. I could read the English portions clearly, and the Twi portions I recognized enough of to piece together with the English around them, and what I was reading, as I stood beside the stripped bed in the guest room with the paper in my hands and the late afternoon light coming in through the window, was something that rearranged everything I thought I understood about the past 2 years in approximately 30 seconds. The list was a plan. Specifically, it was a list of things that would need to happen, and in what order, to bring my mother to live in our house. Not to visit. To live. Permanently. And the role assigned to my mother on this list, in the English portions that were unambiguous and very clear, was not family. It was not support. The Twi word used, which Gregory later confirmed when I showed him, translated most directly as helper. Domestic helper. The list included notes about the guest room being suitable once properly furnished, about the benefits of having someone in the house full-time for cleaning and cooking, about how Sarah's mother would naturally want to help, about how it would solve the problem of the house running without sufficient supervision when both Gregory and Sarah were working. The list also included, in the margin, in smaller writing, a note that appeared to calculate how much could be saved monthly on cleaning services if there were a live-in helper. The number was $400 a month. My mother's potential labor, costed out in her own son-in-law's mother's handwriting, at $400 a month in savings. My hands did not shake. That is what I remember most clearly, how still my hands were, holding that paper, in a way that had nothing to do with calm. It was the stillness of a person whose body has shut down every non-essential function in order to process something at full cognitive capacity. The afternoon light was warm and ordinary on the window. The stripped mattress behind me was impractically, irrelevantly real. I read the list 3 times. Each time I read it, a different section resolved into full clarity, the way your eyes adjust to a dim room and surfaces that were shapes become objects with edges and names. I refolded the paper along its original creases. I placed it back in the box exactly as I had found it. I closed the lid. I finished making the bed. I went downstairs and stood in my kitchen for a long time, my back against the counter, the wooden spoon in the drying rack beside the sink where I could see it without reaching for it, and I thought about Constance asking about my mother's age and her health and whether she had a pension and whether she was alone in the village, and every question recontextualized itself, every warm inquiry revealed the calculation underneath it, and the thing I felt was not grief, not yet, and not quite. Rage, not yet either. It was something more like the sensation of a floor you have been walking on for 2 years, revealing that it was never solid, that what you took for ground was something else entirely. Gregory came home at 9:45. He came in through the garage door, dropped his keys on the hook, called my name, and found me in the kitchen. I had not moved from the counter. I had been standing in approximately the same position for 40 minutes, which I had not registered as 40 minutes because time had done this strange elastic thing it does when you are very quiet inside a very large problem. He looked at me and knew immediately that something was wrong. Gregory was good at reading me physically, better than he was at reading his mother's intentions toward me, which is the specific, painful irony at the center of all of this. He asked what was wrong. I told him I had found something in the guest room and I needed him to tell me what it said. I showed him the list. He read it at the kitchen table, standing up rather than sitting, the way he stood when he was bracing for something. I watched his face while he read it. I watched it go through several configurations in rapid sequence, recognition first, which told me the subject was not entirely new to him, then something that might have been discomfort, then a settling into an expression that I had come to read, over 3 years of marriage, as his preparing to manage this face. He put the paper down on the table. He looked at me. "She's been talking about it," he said. "About your mom coming to help out around the house." I didn't think it was, I thought it was her just, thinking out loud. He said thinking out loud with the particular tone of someone offering an explanation they know is insufficient before they finish offering it. The kitchen light above the table was the same light it always was, warm and steady, making everything look more ordinary than it was. "She costed out my mother's labor," I said, with a steadiness in my voice that surprised even me. "On that paper. $400 a month. That's what she calculated my mother's presence in this house would save in cleaning fees." I watched his face. "Gregory, did you know she was planning this?" The pause that followed that question was the kind of pause that tells you everything before the words do. Not a thinking pause. Not a searching for the right words pause. A deciding how much to admit pause. And in that pause, the first layer of what I thought I understood about this situation peeled back, and underneath it was a second layer that was considerably worse than the first. "She mentioned it to me," he said finally. "The idea of your mom coming. She said it would be good for everyone. That it would be good for you to have your mother close." He looked at the paper. "She said she was going to bring it up with you. She said she wanted to approach it, carefully." He said carefully in a way that sounded like he was repeating a word she had used, and the word sounded, in his mouth, like the description of a strategy. I thought about the dinner party, about really stay, about the pause before it. I thought about how carefully this had been being approached for at least 6 months, possibly longer. I thought about my husband sitting somewhere with his mother while she outlined this plan, and him saying, "What? Okay? That sounds like a good idea?" Or simply nodding and not objecting, which was its own category of agreement. "Did you tell her it was a good idea?" I asked. My voice was entirely level. It was the kind of level that comes when you are conserving something for what comes next. He looked at the table. His hands, both flat on the surface in front of the paper, tightened almost imperceptibly at the knuckles. "I didn't tell her it wasn't," he said. And there it was. The second layer. He had not been ignorant. He had been, and I want to use the precise word, compliant. Not malicious, not scheming, but compliant, in the way of a man who loves his mother and finds it significantly easier to let her plans advance than to position himself between her plans and his wife. He had sat with Constance while she outlined the proposition of bringing my mother across the Atlantic to serve as an unpaid domestic helper in our shared home. And he had not said absolutely not or "you need to talk to Sarah first" or "this is not something we're doing." He had nodded and said nothing and come home and said nothing and kissed me goodnight and said nothing, and this had been happening for months while Constance's list grew longer and more specific on the back of a handwritten page in my guest room. I did not yell at him that night. I am telling you this because I want you to understand the kind of anger I was in, which was not the explosive kind. Not the kind that needs to release through volume or movement. It was the cold, comprehensive kind, the kind that has already moved past the question of how and is working on the question of what now. I took the paper off the table, folded it back along its creases, and put it in the pocket of my cardigan. I told Gregory the first needed to think, and that I would talk to him about it in the morning, and I went upstairs. He did not follow immediately, which was the right call on his part because the wrong call would have produced a conversation neither of us was ready to have at 10 at night with this much unprocessed information between us. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while, the paper in my cardigan pocket pressing lightly against my side, and I thought about my mother in her house 12 time zones away, asleep now, her tomato garden outside her window, her absolute, irreducible dignity, my mother, who had raised me alone after my father died, who had worked as a nurse for 31 years, who had sent me to university and then waved me onto a plane to America with a wooden spoon in my luggage and a composure that had cost her everything. And I thought about Constance Mensa calculating the cleaning fee savings of my mother's presence in her son's house, and something inside me that had been bending for 3 years went very, very straight. The confrontation with Gregory happened the next morning, over coffee, which was how we had all our difficult conversations, the small, domestic ritual of coffee creating just enough normalcy to prevent the conversation from capsizing before it started. I placed the paper on the table between us and I said, carefully and completely, everything I was thinking. I said that I understood he loved his mother and that his sense of obligation to her was deep and real and came from a real place of history and gratitude. I said I understood that Constance's plan had probably been presented to him as something that would be good for everyone, including me, and that he had probably told himself that my mother coming here could be a good thing, which would have made it easier not to look at the rest of what was on that paper. I said I needed him to look at the rest now, clearly, with me, without the buffer of what he wanted it to mean. I slid the paper toward him and I said, she is planning to bring my mother here to clean our house. Not to visit. To work. The word on that list, in Chui, means domestic helper. Not family. Helper. I said, I need you to tell me if you can see that clearly, or if you cannot see that clearly, because the answer to that question tells me everything I need to know about what happens next. He was quiet for a long time. The coffee between us steamed and then stopped steaming. Outside, a car went by on the street, and its sound was very ordinary and very far away. Then he said, I saw it. I think I didn't let myself see it fully. He said it slowly, each word deliberate, the way he spoke when he was being genuinely precise rather than socially careful. I told myself she just wanted your mom here. I didn't look at the whole picture. A pause. I should have told her no immediately. I should have told you. The guilt in his voice was real. I believed it and it was not enough. Real guilt and the behavior it follows are two separate things, and I had been living for 3 years with a man whose real love for me was consistently insufficient to override his real accommodation of his mother, and a morning of genuine guilt was not a structural fix. I told him this. Not cruelly. Precisely. I said, Gregory, this is not the first time. The spice rack. The questions about my mother. The dinner where she said really stay and you heard it and said nothing to her afterward. This has been building for 3 years and every time I've absorbed it because absorbing it felt better than what the alternative required. I am not going to absorb this one. He looked at me. What do you want me to do? I told him he needed to tell his mother, clearly, that this plan was not happening. Not suggest it wasn't a great idea. Not imply it was complicated. Tell her. And then I said, and then I need to watch what you do, Gregory, because what you do next is what tells me who we actually are. He called Constance that morning, from the back deck, while I was inside. I could hear the general cadence of the call through the glass door but not the words. It lasted 22 minutes. When he came back in, his face had the particular quality of someone who has had a difficult conversation and is now managing the after effects. He said he had told her it wasn't happening. He said she had been upset. He said she had only been trying to help, that she had only been thinking about what was practical, that she had thought Sarah would want her mother close. He reported this without editorializing it, which I took as a sign that he understood he was not in a position to editorialize. I thanked him. I made more coffee. And I waited. I didn't have to wait long. Constance called me directly 3 days later. Not Gregory, me, on my cell, at 11 in the morning while I was between meetings at work. I stepped into the hallway and answered because not answering would have produced a version of this conversation that was less controlled than the version available to me right now, and control was the thing I needed most. She said she wanted to talk to me, woman to woman, about a misunderstanding. She said she thought Gregory had not explained her idea properly, that there had been a miscommunication, that she had only ever wanted what was best for all of us. Her voice was warm and measured and completely intact, as if the 22-minute call with Gregory had not touched her composure at all, as if the list in her own handwriting with the cleaning fee calculation were something she was prepared to reframe as a casual note rather than a documented plan. Constance, I said, with the particular quiet of someone who has had 3 days to prepare for exactly this conversation, I found the list. I read the list. I can read English. A pause. I know what you wrote. The silence on the other end lasted approximately 4 seconds, which from Constance was geological in its significance. Then she said, smoothly, the list was just ideas. Notes. I was thinking through options. I said, the options you were thinking through involved my mother crossing an ocean to clean your son's house for savings you calculated at $400 a month. Another pause. Then, and this is the moment I want you to hold on to, the moment where the warmth gave way and what was underneath it became visible, her voice changed. It didn't get louder. It got colder. It got efficient. Your mother is a woman without much occupation, she said, with the particular precision of someone selecting a weapon they have kept sharp for a while. It would be a good life for her. Better than sitting in that village doing nothing. The air in the hospital hallway was antiseptic and cool, and I pressed my back against the wall and breathed through my nose one deliberate time. My mother, I said, is a retired nurse who raised me alone and put me through university. She has more occupation than I can list in this conversation. A pause. And she will never set foot in your son's house as anyone's domestic help. That is the only answer to this plan. I heard Constance take a breath. Then, you are a very difficult woman, Sarah. I said, I know. And I ended the call. But I was not prepared for what came next, because I had been so focused on the list, on the plan, on Constance's calculated warmth and what lived underneath it, that I had missed something. Something that required me, when I found it, to sit very still for a long time and reassemble my understanding of the past 3 years from the ground up. I found it 2 weeks after the phone call, and I found it the way you find most things that have been hidden in plain sight, by accident, while looking for something else entirely. Gregory had left his laptop open on the kitchen table, signed into his personal email, while he went to answer the door for a package. I was not going to look at his email. That was not who I was and not what I was doing. But the screen was there and a subject line was visible in the preview pane, and subject lines are designed to be read, and this one read, the arrangement, timeline. The sender was Constance. The timestamp was 11 months ago. Almost a year before I found the list. I looked at the doorway. Gregory was still at the front door, I could hear him signing for something. I looked at the email preview. The visible portion of the body text contained the words, before she realizes, and it will seem natural by then. My stomach pulled in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. I did not open the email. I photographed the screen, the subject line, the sender, the timestamp, the preview, with my phone, cleanly and quickly, and I stepped back to my original position at the counter, and Gregory came back in with a flat package under his arm, and I smiled at him, and I said nothing. But I was already somewhere else entirely. Because the timestamp on that email was 11 months ago, which meant that this plan, the plan to bring my mother here as a domestic helper, had been in active development and active communication for almost a year before I found the list. Before she realizes. My husband had been a party to email correspondence about a plan to bring my mother to this country as domestic help, correspondence that included the phrase, before she realizes, and he had said nothing, and when I showed him the list he had said I should have told you with genuine sounding guilt, and I had believed the guilt and not pushed further. And now I understood that what I had been given was not the full picture but the manageable picture, the portion he was willing to be guilty about. The portion he thought I would find. The email correspondence was the portion he had believed I would not. I spent that evening with this information alone, which is to say I sat with it while we ate dinner and watched something on television and went to bed, and Gregory slept and I did not, and I turned it over in the dark with the particular care you give to something fragile and decisive, something that has to be handled correctly because handling it incorrectly will break it in a way that makes it useless. I thought about who I could call. My friend Amaka, who had been watching my marriage for 3 years with those careful, patient eyes. My cousin Rita, who was a family lawyer in Houston and who had, 6 months into my marriage, said something to me at a family gathering that I had dismissed at the time as overly cautious. Sarah, understand the terms of your own house before someone else defines them for you. I had smiled and changed the subject. Rita had not pushed. But she had meant it, and I had known she had meant it, and now I was lying in the dark at 2 in the morning thinking about it with the clarity that comes when you are finally ready to know something you have been not knowing for a long time. I texted Amaka at 6 the next morning, before Gregory was awake. I said, I need to talk. Not a quick call. A real conversation. When? She replied in 4 minutes, because Amaka is the kind of person who has her phone ready for the messages she has been expecting. I'm free at noon. I'll come to you. She arrived at noon with food from the place near her apartment that made the pepper soup I liked, and we sat at my kitchen table and I told her everything. The list. The phone call with Constance. The email preview. She listened without interrupting, which was her particular gift. She could hold information without rushing to respond to it, which is rarer than it sounds. When I finished, she put down her spoon and looked at me directly. How long have you known something was wrong? She asked. I thought about the spice rack. The dinner party. The word village. The questions about my mother's pension. 3 years, I said. She nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has been watching from the outside for 3 years and is now watching you arrive at where she has been. What do you need? She asked. I told her I needed 2 things. I needed to talk to Rita, because I needed to understand my legal and financial position before I did anything else. And I needed to have a conversation with Constance, not on the phone, not managed, not the version where Constance controlled the environment, a real conversation, in my house, on my terms, with Gregory present and with what I knew fully visible. Amaka looked at me for a moment. You're not asking my opinion, she said. You've already decided. I told her she was right. She said, then I'll be there when you need me. She said it simply, the way people who love you say the things that matter. The call with Rita happened that afternoon, 40 minutes, Rita's voice clear and precise from Houston. She asked the same kind of questions a good doctor asks, not the questions you expect but the ones that locate exactly where the problem is. She asked whether the house was in both our names. It was. She asked about our financial structure, joint account for household expenses, separate personal accounts, my salary higher by approximately 40%. She asked whether there were any written agreements of any kind. There weren't. She said, the house being jointly owned is the most important fact. If you decide to separate, you have clear equity rights. If you decide to stay and fight for your marriage on different terms, you need documentation of everything you've found, because documented patterns of behavior are what create leverage in conversations, including marital ones. She paused. Sarah. The email with before she realizes. Do you have the photo? I told her I did. She said, keep it. Don't delete it. Don't show it until you're ready to use it, because once you show it the conversation it's in becomes the conversation you're having, and you want to choose when that conversation happens. I said I understood. She said, you've been letting people define the terms for 3 years. You're done doing that. It was not a question. Yes, I said. I'm done. The night before I sat down with Gregory and Constance together was the kind of night where sleep is not really the point. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the wooden spoon in my hand, not using it, just holding it, the worn smooth wood against my palm, the small crack near the handle that my mother had never repaired, and I talked to myself, inside my head, the way you talk to yourself when you're going over a plan, not to rehearse the words but to test the steadiness behind them. I thought about my mother, who had packed that spoon into my luggage 12 years ago without fanfare or ceremony, simply sliding it into the side pocket of my bag the way you pack something practical and necessary. I had cried in the car on the way to the airport, quietly, turned toward the window so my mother wouldn't see, and she had seen anyway and put her hand on my knee and said, "In Igbo, you are not leaving me. You are going further." I had not understood that sentence for years, had turned it over in different years and found different things in it, and sitting in my kitchen the night before the confrontation I understood it in a new way, or perhaps the way she had intended it, that the distance between where you start and where you end up is not a separation from who you are but an extension of it, and that going further requires knowing exactly what you're carrying and why. I was carrying a wooden spoon and 12 years of becoming myself and a level of patience that had served me for 3 years and had now reached its complete, final, adequate end. I put the spoon back in the drying rack. I went to bed. I did not sleep for long, but the hours I did sleep were solid. I told Gregory on Sunday morning that I wanted his mother to come over. He looked at me carefully, with the look he used when he was trying to read the situation before committing to a response. "To talk," he said. "To have a conversation," I said. "All 3 of us. Here. This week." He picked up his phone and called her. She came on Tuesday. Constance arrived at 2 in the afternoon in her good coat and her deliberate composure, and she sat in my living room and accepted tea and looked around the room with her evaluating eyes, and I watched her do it and felt nothing of the shoulder tightening that her presence had produced in me for 3 years, because I was somewhere beyond the range of that particular response now. Gregory sat on the couch. Constance sat in the armchair. I sat across from her in the other armchair, which put us directly facing each other, with Gregory to the side, a geometry I had chosen deliberately, because this was not a conversation between Gregory and his mother with me present. This was a conversation between me and Constance, with Gregory as a witness. I placed the folded list on the coffee table between us. I placed, beside it, a printout of the email thread, not just the one preview I had photographed, but the full thread, which I had asked Gregory the previous day, with complete and flat-voiced clarity, to print and give me. He had done it without arguing. 8 emails over 11 months. The planning, the timeline, the phrase, "before she realizes," the follow-up asking whether Gregory thought I would resist, the response in which Gregory had said, and this was the 3rd layer, the one that arrived like a door opening onto a room I hadn't known was there, "She'll adjust. She always does." He had said that. She'll adjust. She always does. 3 words that contained the entire architecture of what my marriage had actually been. The assumption that my adjustment was a renewable resource that could be drawn on indefinitely, that my capacity to absorb and adapt was a permanent, unconditional feature of the environment rather than a choice I had been making, a choice I was now making differently. Constance looked at the papers on the table. Her face did not change. This was, I thought, the genuine expression of a woman who had believed herself too strategic to be caught, and who was now recalibrating in real time. Gregory looked at the papers and looked at his hands. The afternoon light through the living room window was white and even, the neutral light of a day that has no interest in the proceedings. "I know about the plan," I said, with the particular quiet that is not softness but precision. "I know about all of it. The list, the timeline, the emails." I looked at Constance directly. "I know you planned to bring my mother to this country to work in this house. I know my husband knew about it for 11 months and did not tell me. I know you used the phrase, 'before she realizes,' which means you understood that what you were planning required my not knowing about it until it was too far advanced to reverse. I am not going to pretend I don't know those things or that they require interpretation." I paused. The room was very quiet. "So I'm going to say what I need to say, and then you're both going to say what you need to say, and we're going to have the conversation we should have had a long time ago, instead of the one we've been having. Constance drew a breath through her nose. Gregory still hadn't looked up. My mother, I said, is not a resource. She is not a practical solution to a household management problem. She is a woman who worked for 31 years and who raised a daughter she is proud of, and she will be treated accordingly by everyone in my house or she will not come here at all. That is not a negotiation. I looked at Constance. Do you understand that? The silence stretched. Then Constance said, with a voice that had gone flat and stripped of the warmth she deployed so consistently, you are making this into something it wasn't. I said, the paper in your handwriting says what it says. The emails say what they say. I am not making anything into anything. I am reading what is already there. She looked at Gregory, the look of someone who has always been able to rely on a particular person to absorb the pressure and who is now discovering that the relay is not functioning. Gregory looked up from his hands. And for the first time in 3 years, the first time I could verify, witnessed, in front of his mother, he said, she's right, Mom. It was wrong. What we planned was wrong. Constance stared at him. The stare lasted long enough to be a response in itself, long enough for me to count 5 full seconds. Then she picked up her bag from the floor beside the armchair and stood up. I see, she said, in a voice that was completely without inflection, which was the most alarming version of Constance's voice I had ever heard. You've chosen. She said it to Gregory, as if I were not in the room, as if the choosing were between Constance and some abstraction rather than between Constance and his wife. Gregory looked at his mother and said, with a steadiness I had not heard from him before in her presence, I should have chosen right from the beginning, Mom. I'm sorry I didn't. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at me, and the look was not rage, it was not grief, it was something more controlled and more durable than either, the look of a woman recalibrating a long-term position, and she said, you are a difficult woman, Sarah. I said, you told me that already. I said it without heat, without victory in it, just as a factual observation, because I had stopped needing to perform any emotion for her long before this conversation started. She walked to the front door. She opened it herself. She left. The door closed. The sound of it was quiet and definitive. Gregory sat on the couch with his hands on his knees. I sat in the armchair and looked at the papers on the coffee table, the list and the 8 emails, lying there with the flat patience of documents that have done their work. The afternoon light in the living room had shifted slightly, moving toward the gold of mid-afternoon, and the wooden spoon was in the drying rack in the kitchen, 12 feet away, visible from where I was sitting. What followed was not simple, because nothing real is. Gregory and I had months of conversation ahead of us, not arguments, not performances, but the difficult, granular work of 2 people who have been operating under assumptions that need to be replaced with explicit agreements. We went to couples therapy, which I had suggested and which he had agreed to without resistance, and which was, in the hands of a very precise therapist named Dr. Elaine Park, the most useful 60 minutes a week I had spent in years. Dr. Park had a gift for naming things without judgment, for holding a mirror at exactly the right angle, and what she named, consistently and with complete clinical accuracy, was the dynamic that had been structuring our marriage, a man who had been trained by love and obligation to absorb everything from his mother and deflect everything toward his wife, and a woman who had been trained by patience and accommodation to absorb what was deflected toward her until she couldn't, and then to act. She said these things without assigning blame, and without assigning blame she assigned responsibility, which was far more useful. Constance did not come to our house for 4 months after the Tuesday confrontation. When she did come, at Gregory's invitation, not mine, for a Sunday dinner that Gregory had told me about and asked my permission to host, she came without her coat, which was unusual. She came in a plain sweater and she sat at the kitchen table while I cooked and she said very little for the first hour. At some point, without announcing it, she got up and stood at the counter. She watched me work for a minute. Then she said, without looking at me, the pepper needs more time. I kept stirring. I said, I know. I'm letting it go. She was quiet. Then, good. She sat back down. It was not an apology. It was not even close to adequate as a reckoning with what she had planned and done. But it was the first honest sentence she had said to me in my own kitchen, and I received it as what it was, a small and partial and real thing, and moved forward from it, because moving forward was the only direction available, and I had always been better at that than at staying in one place waiting for something to become different than it was. My mother came to visit 8 months after all of this, which was the visit she had been planning anyway, her usual Christmas trip, 2 weeks in December. She came through the gate at Hartsfield-Jackson in her good traveling clothes, her bag on one shoulder, and she walked toward me with the particular walk of a woman who is completely at home in her body and in the world, and I hugged her in the arrivals hall and smelled the smell of her, shea butter and something warm and specific to her that I cannot name, and the feeling of it was its own complete sentence. Gregory was beside me, and he embraced her too, genuinely, and she patted his arm twice in the way she patted the arms of people she had decided were fundamentally all right but were still on probation. She saw the house and she approved of it in the quiet, comprehensive way she approved of things that met her standard without making a production of meeting it. She cooked twice during her visit, filling the house with smells I had been missing for a year, and she told me I had learned well and she meant it, and on her third morning she picked up the wooden spoon from the drying rack, turned it over in her hands, looked at the crack near the handle, and set it back down without comment. She knew I still had it. That was enough. On her last evening, we sat on the back deck after dinner, my mother and I, while Gregory was inside doing the dishes. This had been established as his unambiguous responsibility in the new terms of our household, one of the explicit agreements that had replaced the old assumptions, and my mother looked at the garden and was quiet for a while, the way she was quiet when she was thinking something she was deciding whether to say. Then she said, in Igbo, "You went further." I understood her then the way I had understood her in the car to the airport 12 years ago, and also completely differently, the way you understand the same sentence at different distances and find it has a different shape from each one. I said, I did. She nodded. She did not need more than that, and neither did I. The wooden spoon is still in my drying rack. It is the same spoon it was when my mother packed it into my luggage, worn smooth and cracked near the handle and used every week. It is also not the same spoon, because nothing remains the same through everything I have described without accumulating the weight of all of it, the weight of 3 years of absorbing and then the weight of the moment I stopped absorbing, and all the weight of what came after. When I pick it up now I do not think about Constance's look when she first set it down. I think about my mother's hands, and I think about the pepper needing more time, and I think about the particular kind of further that is not away from anything but into something, into the full, difficult, real, specific life you are actually living, with everything you actually know, on terms you have actually agreed to. It is a good weight to carry. It has always been mine.